Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having enrolled, attended, and for being here at our Latin American Studies Association, Asia-Oceania First Continental Congress in Melbourne, Australia, right here at the city campus. And I have to say, I'm so delighted. I'm really, really happy and really pleased to see you here. And before we start our first plenary, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which we're meeting in person today, but also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of those who participate in this Congress in other areas across the world, including our esteemed presenters online. And this is the first of two plenaries for the Congress. This plenary is a roundtable. It's on the state of Asia, Oceania, Latin American studies, mapping knowledge connection agendas. The main purpose of this roundtable is for us to engage in a common set of reflections about where Latin American studies and how it sits, both in Australia, but also in dialogue with Asia, with Latin America. The discipline, as we know it, has changed significantly over the course of the last few decades. And we rarely have the opportunity to take stock and to engage in common reflection in a venue, and I would say in a transcontinental space as this is. So without further ado, we do have roundtable. We have 7 exciting presenters, and what I'm going to do is we have 7 of us. Each of you have between 6-7 minutes to offer some reflections. I'm also going to be writing a few questions for them towards the end. But please, and let me say, please again, por favor, ask questions, engage, make comments. It's, as you can see, this is your salon. If you want to pull the chairs over here, get closer, you name it. The idea is that this is an open mesa redonda. This is an open round table. And without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to follow the order of the speakers or presenters as they are in our official list. And we're going to start with our dear friend and colleague Vladimir, who joins us from ISESI, Cali, Professor Vladimir Rubinsky. Vladimir, you came, 15,000 kilometers or more?
Wow. Now I'm scared because I didn't know the number.
It is a long number, but I have to say Vladimir has been chair of the section of Asia and the Americans in the Latin American Studies Association, but also one of the leading researchers across the region on Asia and America more generally, and particularly on studies of the connection between China and Latin America. He lives and works in Cali, Colombia at ISESI, and it is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Raul, and thank you very much for everyone attending this first Continental LASA Asia-Oceania Congress. And just to share something about Raul and I, because when we started to discuss how we want to have this plenary section, I think we quickly came to a conclusion that it shouldn't be yet another panel on geopolitics and relations and politics and economics between Asia, Oceania, and Latin America. But instead, as Raul already mentioned, we wanted to talk about who we are, what we study, and why our work is relevant in the context of this rapidly changing world dynamics. So what I would like to share with you as introductory remark, and then of course we can have this roundtable, we can have the questions hopefully and hopefully answer them. I think one of the ideas that I hope that many of you share is that today it's very clear. We cannot fully understand Latin America if we are not talking about Asia and Oceania. And we cannot fully understand the processes that are taking place here in Australia, in Asia, if we are not taking into consideration the relations of this region with Latin America. And why this has happened in this way is because, of course, the global dynamics have been changing for some times now, but it's became very clear that in this new world order, and we still, I think, do not know exactly where we're heading. Well, we do know where we're going, but I think it would be just too early to say that we know for sure what the shape of this new order would be. I think it's very clear that the relations between these two regions will be at least one of the defining dynamics for us to understand actually the shape of this new world order. So what I would like to share with you in the beginning is basically some of the preliminary results that we obtained, I and some of my colleagues at the UCS University, when we actually analyze 144 profiles of the scholars who made part of our section, Asia and the Americas, in the last 5 years. Just try to see their geographical locations, where they're based, what kind of topics they are studying, and perhaps what kind of priority themes they have. So the result shows that as far as geographic distribution is concerned of those people who making part of the Asian and the American sections of LASA, 44% are based in the United States, 28% are based in Latin America, 21% based in Asia and Oceania, and we have 8% of the colleagues who studied these issues, Asia and Latin America in Europe, and 3% are based in Canada. So what this means from my perspective is that our networks is genuinely transnational, with research hubs distributed across the Americas, Asia, Oceania, and Europe. And there is no single dominant region. Instead, there are multiple centers of knowledge production that coexist and interact. Also, another interesting fact about the composition of the section that is actually quite balanced. We have 57% women and 43% men. So women are actually taking a very interesting role and shaping the agenda and also contributed in the research. So I'm very happy that our section actually has been for a long time, I think, characterized by these balanced relations. So what are the major topics? Perhaps not surprisingly, China stands out. So about 1/3 of the research that is done by the scholars who are making part of this section is about China, Latin America. Japan, Latin America occupies the second place. Korea, Latin America follows, and Southeast Asia and Latin America about 5% of all the research. The topics that are dealt with is, of course, diplomacy, development, finance, infrastructure, political economy, security, migration. But if we move away from the geographical connection between particular countries in Asia and Latin America, the topics that are most interested, that scholars are most interested in, is political economy, development, international relations. About 28% of the research is about those topics. Cultural studies, literature, translations, 21%. Migration, diaspora, race, it's been actually a topic that's been discussed for a long time within the framework offered by the sections. Intellectual history and circulation of ideas is 12%, but there are also topics as public diplomacy, international education, academic mobility. So what these numbers shows us that I think there are very interesting tendencies in this, say, already not so much emergent, but an emerged area of studies between Asia and Latin America that has been truly transdisciplinary, that there is actually a dialogue across different parts of the world. And last but not least, and I will finish with this, I think LASA showed its capacity to facilitate this kind of network building that facilitate the creation of knowledge. And the fact that we are here is actually one of the clear evidences of the role that LASA is doing, helping us. So I stop here and I'm looking very much for the questions.
Thank you very much. And thank you, of course, Vladimir, as well, for keeping your remarks to the time, which is always appreciated in the context of a roundtable or panel. Next, we have our dear colleague and friend, Adrian Hearn, Professor Adrian Hearn, and I want to, this is a celebration as well because Professor Hearn has a new book. And it's actually a great example, I would say, of genuine transcontinental comparative, transcontinental comparative exercise on a key relevant topics across different issue areas, but most importantly, of major relevance for different societies that, despite the differences, find this as in common. Professor Hearn is a professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Melbourne, and I have to say, this is a bit of a homecoming for you as well, Adrian, because he did his PhD at La Trobe. And I wanted to remark that because we've always been proud of your career in connection to the university, and I wanted to mention that as well. And I just want to cite very quickly the description of Adrian's book, and I encourage you to also look it up at MIT Press. This is a cutting-edge analysis of food systems sustainability, including COVID's impact on current food systems, up-to-date case studies of community farms in Australia, Brazil, Cuba, and China. And one of such community farms actually not too far from where I live, right here in Brunswick, and which is called Ceres. And I imagine that was one of the inspirations for such a great project. Take it away, Adrian. Can you share some comments about the project with our...
Is it okay if I stand up so I can see people, or will that cause technical problems? It's okay?
Please do, please do.
Great, I just want to see people at the back there too. It's great to see friends and faces that I know, some that I don't. And just to acknowledge as well, this privilege to be here, this opportunity to be part of this panel, to try to get things rolling here at this LASA Asia Oceania. And I think, that's right. If we think about what Vladimir said just a moment ago, the importance of Latin America and Asia for each other, then we can look for examples of that, not only globally, but right here locally. And we can find that right here in Melbourne. Maybe I'll just say a thing or two about that. But as Raul mentioned, that's right. I came to Australia because I wanted to do a PhD. I couldn't do it in the US where I'd been growing up because of the political problems between the US and Cuba. I wanted to go and live in Cuba. I immersed myself. I'm an anthropologist, so I wanted to live there. But doing that from the US was really impossible. And it turned out that there was an opportunity to do that right here at La Trobe University in Melbourne. It was my first, I suppose, indication of how geopolitics can affect us personally, right? It made me move all the way from the US to Australia to then study Cuba, which is, as you know, right next to the US. And it sort of made me realize then at that point that there was really no way to escape these geopolitical trends and geopolitical dynamics. That became more and more evident over the years. And so pretty soon after that project, I was looking for a job, like many of us probably are after doing a PhD, right? And we think, well, how do we sort of blend our personal interests with the demand that's out there, the kind of things that universities want, that selection panels are going to look for? And after about 30 job applications, a friend said, and not even one interview, by the way, a friend said, Adrian, what are you doing? Proposing a project on Cuba. Do you think Cuba's important for Australia? I thought, wow, okay, well, he said, what country is important for Australia? I thought around, he said, come on, China. Well, really, okay. And I started thinking about that, and I realized at that point that, again, the geopolitics has to be part of our own kind of personal awareness and development if we're going to go forwards professionally. Got to be conscious of these things. And so that kind of launched me 20 years or so ago on a career studying relations between China and Latin America. And what I found quite quickly is what Vladimir just said, that the two are very interdependent. And it became quite evident in the agriculture sector, which is the topic of that book, where we see that Brazil is the #1 supplier of soybeans to China. Now, why is that important? Why does China want so many soybeans? Well, if you've been to China, if you've stayed with a Chinese family, you'll know, #1, that pork is a very important part of the urban diet. China's trying to urbanize, trying to create pools of consumers so that it doesn't have to rely on sending its products overseas. If we look at where the clothes are from and the machinery is from and the tables and the carpet, and most of this is made in China, right? China depends on those exports, but as we keep hearing through the years, doesn't want to be so dependent, so needs to sell its products internally. Therefore, urbanization is necessary. As part of that, then people move out of the countryside into the cities and they stop producing food, but they still need to eat. They need high protein diets, and pork is the #1 thing. But how do you feed the pork industry? Pigs eat soy meal. And that's where Brazil comes in as the #1 provider, the world's largest provider of soybeans. And so, again, we see that interaction, that interdependence of the two regions. And it's not just Brazil and China, it's the US as well. So in the Brazilian case, about $50 billion of soybeans each year, US dollars. The US sends about $40 billion each year of soybeans to China. So again, there's a massive interdependence there between China and the US just to sustain the diets of people in cities. In the case of Australia, it's a bit different. We don't produce soybeans here, but we do produce a lot of wheat and barley. And as you will find if you drive to the west or the north of Melbourne, you'll come across barley plantations and wheat plantations pretty quickly. And about $5 billion each year of that product goes to China. And in each of those contexts, we see a similar process. The expansion of commodity plantations, which are taking over the land around cities. And that's important because cities need to feed themselves, right? And when cities stop growing their own food to feed themselves, they have to get it from further and further away. So this increases food miles. It also means that as those areas get taken over, people can't live there anymore. The ground gets contaminated with chemicals. The rents or the taxes go up, so people can't pay them. What happens? They move into the cities. This produces even more urban expansion and takes over even more land. In the case of Melbourne, about 40% of what we eat in Melbourne comes from the green belt around Melbourne. But by 2050, Melbourne's population will double to about 9 million people. And by that point, we'll only produce about 20% of what we eat in the green belt, because the belt is disappearing for these very reasons. So it's just to give one example, right, of these interconnections between Asia, the Americas, and how we can find those right here. I think one question it raises, and I will finish on this, is what can we do? Can we do anything as researchers? Can universities have some hand in trying to, raise awareness and even improve the situation? Right? What can we do? What can we as researchers do? And there's no easy answer to that. But one thing we're good at is putting on events such as this, but also other kinds of events, public forums, where we can bring together people that wouldn't ordinarily meet each other. We can think of community organizations, researchers, NGOs, government officials. There aren't many kinds of institutions that can bring people from such a wide range of backgrounds into one place to talk and understand each other. We can apply for grants, development grants. As you probably know, our government, through the Department of Foreign Affairs, DFAT, has a grants program that is directed specifically at doing community projects. And so one thing we can do in terms of this big agriculture dynamic that we've been talking about is we could apply for grants that help small farmers to push back against the real estate developers, against the plantation developers. Now, how successful they'll be, we don't know, but we can try and we can do it. There's a lot of evidence of community farming growing around the world, including here in Ceres, right here where Raoul lives in Brunswick. It's a really thriving system, and the way that it works is that it it buys produce from farmers in and around Melbourne and then has an online platform for selling that produce to consumers within the city. We see this now in Sao Paulo as well, the same model. It's developed as well in Beijing and in other cities. So there are things that can be done, and these kinds of initiatives need support. And again, universities can do something there. So I suppose I would just say, if we're interested in some of these issues that really are affecting people and affecting us, let's not just study them, let's get involved in them. Let's try to do something. Let's apply for grants. Let's work with people. Let's engage. I really appreciate that that's what LASA has been increasingly doing. And the section for Asia and the Americas is really leading the charge in that way. It's an amazing section that Vladimir is now chairing. Similarly, the Inter-American Dialogue has been looking at these issues. And for many years, I've been fortunate to work with Margaret in Washington, D.C., again, bringing people together that wouldn't normally meet. In fact, some of the grants that we've received to do this work resulted from those workshops in D.C. So universities can do things. Let's keep that in mind as we go forward through the conference. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. And that's actually a few questions. I'm going to leave them for first. There are questions after we're done with the presentations. But next is a great segue for our next presenter, and that's Fernanda Peñalosa from the University of Sydney. And I want to very briefly just cite Fernanda's own description in her university website. Fernanda is a Latin Americanist with a strong background in critical theory and expertise in the field of Latin American cultural studies. And here comes a key word: interdisciplinary in nature. Her work is primarily concerned with how knowledge production and political, economic, and cultural forces shape the way in which the peoples of Latin America and the region itself, both as a signifier and as a geopolitical location, are discursively constructed. And as we spoke, Fernanda, the importance, of course, as well, of the connection between research, universities, and community and society and going and the ground. Leave it up to you.
I was asked to speak in Spanish, so I'm sorry for imposing this on some of you, but I think it's always the case when we are in these multilingual spaces to choose between Portuguese or Spanish.
Absolutely.
It's not always the case, so I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woi, Wurrung, and Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and also the different indigenous communities that we come from. I think it's very important to, as a migrant woman in Australia, for me, it's very important to acknowledge how I benefit from this historical process of dispossession and how I can actually contribute in some way to pathways for reconciliation, for healing, collective healing. I also would like to acknowledge my huge epistemic debt in regards to Indigenous people's struggles, Afro-descendant struggles, and women's rights movements, including transgender women and other so-called global majorities now, because in Latin America, and I'm saying this because I am a Latin American woman from Latin America, I have Indigenous and European background. Very rarely we've seen any sort of interesting development coming solely from academia. The developments that we've seen, the great contribution that we've seen at methodological and theoretical level, always have to do with the academics being activists. And what I've seen, what I've noticed, I mean, I have no expertise on Asia whatsoever, so I'm not very sure how I fit in this table. But what I think is quite important to acknowledge is that geopolitical context that Vladimir and also Adrian were referring traverses us all. And one important lesson that I got from my case, when I came from the UK to take up this position at the University of Sydney, which is the oldest university in Australia, and the Department of Spanish and Latin American Studies had been founded 1 year before I came here, so in 2007, I arrived here also in 2008, is that we need to be constantly justifying our existence as a field of expertise. That justification is even greater when we look at the ways in which we have to legitimize and validate our expertise, not as objects of studies, but actually agents of change, agents who actually practice our own agency. I was in dismay when I realized that there was a lot of expertise in Latin American studies, but a lot of it was being carried out without any knowledge of the language or the cultural elements in Australia. That to me was quite a shock. Things have evolved, and I'm talking about less than 20 years ago. Things have evolved, and what we have seen is more and more, unfortunately, that language and cultural departments that were at the core of the development of Latin American studies in Australia have been shrinking. I'm in a very privileged position, despite the fact that I have to endure daily forms of oppression as an academic who is not taken seriously necessarily in this context of the Anglo-dominant culture in universities. But I've seen, I'm in a very privileged position because at the University of Sydney, we have a very large department, Spanish and Latin American Studies, of 6 members of staff with hundreds of students. But the reality is that a lot of our universities, even in Sydney, UTS, UNSW, Wollongong, they have been impacted by structural issues. And that is also connected with global geopolitical developments. My contribution to this table is that I think we need to be a little bit more creative. We have, I think we've been trying very hard, being very creative to sustain and to expand what we've done so far. And I'm only talking about the context of Latin American studies in Australia, because unfortunately now it has become a global trend. We've seen this is happening in the UK. The experience that I had in the UK for 8 years is already looking quite grim. It's not the place I left. So I think for younger generations, we need to make sure that we do create spaces like this where there is collective effort to support daring and innovative ways of rethinking within and beyond how we want to shape Latin American studies. With all these constraints, I mean, there is a strong tradition in our region to really resist oppression, to really come up with alternative forms of channeling agency. And I think that's the key. Keeping in mind that we have produced great knowledge in our region, we just have to make it visible in this part of the world. That's the challenge. But, you know, one example that I want to give, and with this I will finish, is that I'm horrified to see how everyone, and I do a lot of work around multiculturalism and health, for example, and anti-racism as well, how everyone is talking about co-design. Co-design is a recall of participatory action research, which of course was not invented in Latin America, but I would say was pretty much perfected as a method in Latin America. And we need to make sure that we draw attention to these histories of knowledge production. We don't end up being objectified and commodified, because there is a great intellectual potential for us to contribute to global dialogues that are very, very crucial. Because as Vladimir said, we don't really know where we are heading, but there is a great deal of uncertainty. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. So, and when we, and you will notice that when we set up this roundtable, we also, it was a roundtable, but it was also kind of an hexagon, because we wanted to touch the different points of what makes Latin American studies and the study of Asia, Latin America, Australia, transmissible in a single event. To those ends, we also have a special guest from New Zealand joining us online. And this is Professor Leonel Alvarado from Massey University. And Leonel, when I was reading your biography, one thing that really caught my attention is the how in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you've been able to promote, engage, and develop Portuguese studies as well, or a focus on the study of Portuguese, which if teaching Spanish is already restricted, well, teaching Portuguese in Australia, New Zealand is even more restricted. I mean, and this is something that is very important for these reflections. The study of the languages, of course, is under siege pretty much everywhere in the West. It's certainly the case here in Australia and New Zealand as well. So without further ado, I will leave Leonel to
Tēnā
share
koutou
with us.
katoa, ko se resulte manga, koko pante agua, ko Honduras te whenua o kutipuna, I te tau rua manu marua, I haere mai au ki Aotearoa. Ko Leonel Alvarado toko ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tato katoa. That is what is in Te Ao Maori, on the Maori word called emihi, in which you introduce yourself and you talk about first the things that are more important. In this case, talk about my mountain, my river, my places, the places that I identify with. And then I move on to something that is also important when I arrived in New Zealand in 2002. And the least important of all is my name, because the mountains and the rivers existed before us, obviously. But the fact of coming from Honduras is not that important either, because here, working in the field of Latin American studies, people ask me if I am from Mexico or Colombia or Paraguay, and I always say yes, that I am, because I get the pleasure of talking about those countries without being from there, but I do feel from them through the writers, to the wonderful music, to the wonderful culture, to the wonderful literature, or in the case of, as you were saying, Raul, Brazil, to the wonderful music and the language. So I do feel as that kind of an ambassador, perhaps, even though I'm a fake Brazilian or a fake Paraguayan or a fake Mexican. But I do have that enormous pleasure of talking about Latin American studies. When I arrived here in 2002, I noticed that there was a trend in Spanish, or Hispanic studies, as they've been called for a while, of focusing mainly on Spain or peninsular Spanish, for obvious reasons, and the connection between Australia, New Zealand, and Europe has always been there. But there was a shift, I think, in the last perhaps 3 decades towards Latin America, more interest in Latin America. And that had to do, I had the feeling, with 3 factors. One was immigration. In 1976, 400 Chileans arrived in New Zealand during the time of, the beginning of the dictatorship in Chile. And then the Latin American population began to increase here, to the point now that we have around 12,000 Brazilians, and then around 3,000 Chileans and Argentinians, and then Mexicans, Colombians, etc. So that was one factor. The other was the fact that many Latin American academics, or a few Latin American academics, including myself, arrived here in Aotearoa, in New Zealand. And then the government began to pay attention to Latin America, because as we know, the engagement has been traditionally with Asia, I mean, with China, still is, right? But Latin America became some sort of an interest. There was some curiosity to see what was happening over there across the Pacific in Latin America. And some governments created opportunities to foster this exchange, academic exchange or trade exchange, to the point that some countries in Latin America, namely Chile, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, became priorities for the New Zealand government. And we have embassies over there. There's also an embassy in Argentina, mainly for trade reasons, but also for cultural exchange, for academic exchange, student recruitment, and in the areas, in the case of academic research, that have been the focus for many decades have been sciences, agriculture, for instance, veterinary studies, food tech. Later on, the humanities and social sciences came in. Indigenous knowledges, for instance, is an area that is very important in the case of out there in New Zealand in this conversation with Latin America. Indigenous health. Last year, I had the pleasure of leading a delegation of early career researchers to Latin America from different universities here in Aotearoa to Chile, Brazil, and Colombia. And there was a great deal of interest over there in Latin America to engage with Aotearoa, New Zealand in many of these areas. For instance, at my university, there's a strong department of Maori studies where they have developed teaching materials, or the teaching of Te Reo Maori that are used in Mexico. So this exchange has become very important, and I've been telling students for many years that Aotearoa, New Zealand is the perfect place to learn Spanish because we have so many commonalities. Both Te Reo Maori and Spanish are phonetic languages. So the students of Te Reo and Spanish will have a flawless pronunciation. They don't have any issues with pronunciation. And also, we've rich indigenous cultures, and there is a colonial past. This relationship with Europe. So many commonalities, and so the landscape has changed, but as Fernanda was saying, well, we also have been through a few difficult challenges. I joke that one of my missions is for every Kiwi to learn a bit of Spanish and Portuguese, but that's been a fight. It's been a challenge, and in the last few years, for instance, we've seen so many cuts, especially in funding, and so many cuts in initiatives. There was a very generous scholarship for Latin Americans to come and study here that no longer exists. I also had the pleasure of taking groups of students to Colombia and to Brazil. That opportunity no longer exists, despite the fact that the things seem to be dire in the case of languages. I don't think I will fulfill my dream of making every Kiwi to learn a bit of Spanish and Portuguese. Despite that, there is a very active engagement going on with Latin America. If the funding disappears, if we no longer have the support from government, researchers themselves are very invested in this kind of relationship. And we know how valuable it is. And we keep fostering these connections. And something that is very important is bringing new career researchers into the equation. Either Latin Americans who are here, who went to school here, who stay here, decided to make their life here, or mainly Kiwis who study here and who see this relationship with Latin America as very important for them and for the country. So in this, the connection with Latin America continues, and as I said, despite the obstacles, despite the difficulties, the engagement is still there, and that is very valuable for us. Thank you so much. Kia ora.
I have a few takeaway points as well. One of them that is very important and in connection to what you're about to do as well, Adrian, is the importance of international study tours and of international mobility and student mobility between Australia, New Zealand, and Latin America, which, as we know, these are expensive programs, very difficult to set up and so forth, but at the same time, como dice la canción, donde uno, conecta 10. Once someone goes there, the enthusiasm, having the experience of going to Latin America is infectious. They come back, and not only their lives are transforming the way they see the region. They see Australia or their own place as well, but also they spread the word about the importance and the relevance, of course, of getting to know the region in person. We will continue now our roundtable with our dear friend Fabricio Tocco, speaking from Canberra. Hola, Fabricio. And Fabricio he's a novelist. Now, he recently published a very good novel that we had the opportunity to launch right here at La Trobe. He's also an academic. He's studied Latin America from different, Latin America, well, in Spanish, from different places and studied in different places too. Fabricio, welcome to the forum. I'll leave you to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Raul. Thank you, everyone there in Melbourne. I hope you can hear me well. My internet connection seems to be a bit patchy, so I apologize in advance if I suddenly disappear. I'll try to come back as soon as I can. I might sound a bit killjoy with what I'm about to say, as Sarah Ahmed terms this notion of killjoy, or party pooper, as in more classical terms. So I'm talking from Canberra. I acknowledge I'm talking from the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples territory. And unlike Lionel's experience in New Zealand, very recently we had to, for instance, shut down the Portuguese program. The ANU was the only university in all of Australia that offered Portuguese for credit. We didn't have enough students. I had just joined the ANU and the situation was a bit irreversible. So there was not much I could do at that stage. And we no longer offer Portuguese in Australia for credit. Of course, students can take it as a language outside of their degrees. But the discipline as a language discipline doesn't exist anymore in Australia. I always give an example of how I think it's very eloquent of how we are perceived, perhaps outside of our disciplines, which is that very recently, last year, there was a Global South Fellowship, and the image of the call for papers call for applications for that fellowship had just Southeast Asia as the Global South. There was no Africa, there was no Latin America. And I think that we in this room are all aware, we don't need to be convinced of all the very evident relations that exist between our regions in terms of diplomatic exchange, migration, in terms of economic relations. I think that the work that Adrian and Fernanda have done has been a role model in terms of connecting very clearly the commonalities between Asia and Latin America, in the case of Adrian, in the case of Fernanda, the south-to-south connections between Australia and, for instance, Argentina. But I think that we have a very big task ahead of us, especially in the people that are not in our discipline, especially in the people who are outside of our disciplines, not even necessarily outside of the university. For instance, we had recently here in Canberra a huge, very successful Latin American cultural event. It's called La Fiesta. There is really an interest in Latin America in, I think, Australian society. I think the resistance or the indifference is more in our colleagues outside of our discipline. And I think that that's where our task should be focused on in terms of increasing our relevance, increasing our visibility. And I agree with Fernanda that it is a bit annoying and it's a bit draining to have to put so much energy in justifying yourself. But I think that it's a task that is very important and it's very necessary. I only arrived to Australia 3 years ago. I'm very new to Australia, I think, still. But I came from Canada. And in Canada, people, Latin American diaspora, usually would compare themselves to the Latin American diaspora in the US. And they would always feel in disadvantage. They would think that Latin America is not as present or as relevant for Canadians. but they should come to Australia for a little bit to see the difference. When I moved here from Canada to Australia, I was very surprised because we do have a sizable migrant community of Latin Americans, a growing migrant community. And I think that, yeah, we should fight for gaining more visibility, especially outside of our disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabricio. And I think your points are an excellent segue for our next presenter, and that's Ben Poveda, Ben is joining us from the Northern Territory. No, you're currently in Darwin, I think, Ben.
Yeah.
Ben is originally from Colombia. He was an international student here in Australia, and he went on not only to graduate, but also become a leader as a student leader and also in the community. And nowadays, works for the Northern Territories Government the Office in Youth Affairs, I think. But he's also a board member of the of COALA, which is our main DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade body for promoting Latin America in Australia. So he comes with those two hats and multiple perspectives. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
Thank you. Gracias, Raul, and thanks, LASA, for the kind invitation. Yes, joining from Larrakia land, all the way in Darwin, Northern Territory. My name is Ben Poveda Alfonso, as Raul mentioned, born in Colombia and came to Australia 10 years ago as a very proud international student. And I now work in youth policy with the NT government while serving on COALAR. So my contribution today is slightly different to everyone else who has spoken. Comes from less academic or bibliometrics, but more from lived experience. From being part of the Latin American diaspora in Australia and working in the intersection of community, government, and international engagement. So I want to share a few reflections on how these connections look from vantage point and what they may mean for the future of Latin American studies in our region, in my experience. So I'll start with my own trajectory as a micro map of the field for everyone's convenience. So if I look at my own trajectory, I can almost draw a small map of this field. I arrived in Darwin in Northern Australia as a Colombian international student. So for many people, when they think about Australia, they think of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and that's okay. But Darwin is literally closer to parts of Southeast Asia and cheaper to travel than to some Southern Australian cities. So it is very particular place to land as a Latin American student. And I will tell you why this is important a little bit later. So my university, in my case, Charles Darwin University, was my first bridge between Latin America and Oceania through my degree, my scholarships, and the opportunities of leadership and volunteering that I had. So very quickly, those links moved beyond the classroom. Not only what I was learning, but together with other international students and local allies and community members, we began to create community organizations, cultural festivals, and support networks, which interestingly, some of the speakers have talked about earlier. So we were trying to respond to these very practical questions. How do we support students who are isolated or struggling financially? This was during COVID times. But also, how do we make our culture visible in a small city? Some of the speakers earlier mentioned on how we fight against validation and those challenges that we face as Latin Americans, perhaps, and especially now in a small city where there were very few Latin Americans. And the third question also, how do we build bridges with local communities and First Nations peoples, which are very important, and also talked about with the panel members. 30% of the population in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal people. So those experiences later opened doors into government for me, where I now lead the Office of Youth Affairs and also into COALAR, which explicitly works for Australian Latin American relations across things like diplomacy, education, culture, and business. But in that same sense, I am part of the data this field often talks about. I think the first speaker, Vladimir, talks a lot about data. So I'm an international student, I'm a migrant, I'm part of the diaspora community, but we are not just numbers in a survey or a statistic in a report. We're also co-producers of knowledge and the relationship between our regions. And that is important to continue to acknowledge and talk about. So from where I sit, migration and diasporas are not only objects of study, they are knowledge producers. Across Australia and New Zealand, as Lionel earlier mentioned, Latin American students and graduates are constantly generating insights about belonging, about well-being, work, racism, identity, community organizing, but also intercultural dialogue. We do this through formal research projects, yes, but also through things that provide opportunities for students to have their voices heard, like youth councils, student associations, community organizations, but also informal mutual support networks, irrespective of where we are based. So in the Northern Territory, for example, we have seen Latin American students and former students or graduates building supporting networks during crises and emergencies, really leading the country on lots of these things, organizing cultural festivals that have attracted thousands of people and bring Latin America into the public space so people can learn about us, and volunteer, advocate, and later now as me as an example, but many others, advising government on youth, multiculturalism, and also international education, which is a clear linkage for all of us here. So these spaces, community organizations, festivals, youth projects become practical laboratories of trans-Pacific relations, in my opinion, again. They are places where questions about identity, race, class, gender, and power are negotiated every day in very concrete ways. But yet, in many cases, their voices are still marginal in the mainstream narrative of Latin American studies. We often cite migrants as students, as participants, as informants, rather than recognizing them as co-authors of the agenda. So one question that I carry is, how can this field, and this is a bit of a test for all of us here, how can this field move more deliberatively from starting diaspora communities to truly partnering with them, defining these questions, methods, and outputs of our work? That was my first reflection. The second one is about international education, which is key on everything that we are talking about. International education has quietly become one of the most important infrastructures for Asia, Oceania, and Latin American studies. The growth in Latin American student numbers in Australia and New Zealand over the last decade has been remarkable. Every cohort brings new stories, skills, and connections across the Pacific. We have similar but also very different experiences, and we bring wealth of knowledge and experiences to Australia. But we often treat those students as temporary presence only. They arrive, they study, they work casually, they struggle, some of them, or they thrive, also some of them, and they either go home or stay on. So along the way, they accumulate huge amount of knowledge about both regions, about institutions, about labor markets, politics, culture, and everyday life, and the differences between Latin America and how we live lives here in Australia. So if we see international education as infrastructure, the question becomes, how do we design it to support long-term two-way relationship between our regions and not just short-term enrollments? So there is enormous potential, in my opinion. Co-design research projects that involve international students, alumni, and community organizations as partners, not just participants, like I mentioned earlier. Internships and placements that connect Latin American students with government and civil society in places like the NT, not only the capital cities, perhaps Western Australia too. Alumni networks that are genuinely bi-regional and that feed back into teaching, policy, and community work. So from a youth policy perspective, these students and young professionals are also our future leaders and potential diplomats of our relationship. So we should be much more intentional about supporting their leadership and capturing their insights. So to end, and looking ahead, I see at least 3 emerging agendas where Asia, Oceania, Latin American studies could play a bigger role. The first one is youth. Young people are at the center of many of our Trans-Pacific stories, as students, as workers, as activists, as digital creators now in the world of social media, but also as community leaders. Their experiences of mobility, precarity, resilience, online and offline participation deserve to be much more visible in our research agendas. There is rich opportunity here to connect youth studies, Latin American studies, and Indo-Pacific studies in more systemic ways, in my opinion. That was the first one. The second one, regions. I'll continue to advocate for it because it is very important. There is a reason why I'm not there in Melbourne. I'm joining here from Darwin, from Larrakia land. A lot of our conversations focus in Sydney, Melbourne, but also Auckland, Santiago, Sao Paulo. But some of the most interesting experiments may also be happening in places like the Northern Territory or regional Queensland or smaller New Zealand towns in regional cities in Latin America. In these places, communities are smaller, institutions are closer, and relationships are more personal. And that can create fertile ground for innovative partnerships between universities, local governments, indigenous communities, and diasporas. And the third one and last, co-design. The most impactful initiatives that I have actually seen are those where academics, governments, community organizations, and groups like COALAR sit at the same table, share power, and build something together, whether that is a youth program, a cultural festival, again, or a research project or a policy initiative. For the field of Latin American studies and Asia Oceania, this might mean moving more deliberatively again towards methodologies and partnerships that are participatory, long-term, and responsive to community priorities, not only to academic incentives. So the questions that I'll leave you all with, just if you let me finish, rather than conclusions for our conversation today, but just something to think about. First, how can we move from studying Latin American diasporas in Oceania to truly partnering with them in setting the research agenda and co-producing knowledge? Second, how would it look like if international education policy and Latin American studies were hand in hand to support long-term reciprocal relationships between our regions, relationships that include, but also go beyond student numbers and trade statistics, which we often talk about. And lastly, how do we ensure that young people, students, early career researchers, as someone mentioned earlier, community organizers or emerging diplomats are not only beneficiaries of this field, but also recognized as their architects or co-authors? So those are questions that I carry with me from my work in youth affairs and from my role in COALAR, and I'm very keen to hear how they resonate with your experience and with the comparative perspectives that other panelists will bring today and those in the audience who I've seen are present. So thank you again, Raul, for the opportunity. And LASA, these are my 2 cents in this conversation.
Thank you for joining us, man. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. And we have our last presenter now, last but not least, Margaret Myers, who is actually joining us from Washington, D.C. Margaret is the director of the Asian Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. And she also worked with us recently in setting up a workshop right here at La Trobe. Yesterday, it is an honor to come with your presence, Margaret. Welcome to La Trobe.
I'll stand too, just so that you can all see me more than anything else. So, yeah, I mean, I think, well, if we're talking about party poopers, right, people from Washington, D.C. can often be delivering sort of party pooping type messages. And I think I'm not going to be so different in that respect. What I can do, I think, is offer a perspective on where things stand in Latin American studies, on China Latin America studies in particular, which is what I focus on, but across certain different communities in the United States. So you have the think tank community, right, which is rather robust in Washington and in other parts of the country. And I'd like to give some perspectives on where things stand there. the academic community. So I'm now a senior advisor at the Inter-American Dialogue, but I'm also a faculty member at Johns Hopkins SAIS and also teach a course at Georgetown University. So have had some experience, speaking with faculty there and thinking through some problems that we're facing in the Latin American studies field and also in the sort of delivery of information on China-Latin American relations within these academic communities. And so I'll offer some thoughts on that as well. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about China's approach to Latin American studies and where that's heading, what the trends are. That's something that we've studied at the Inter-American Dialogue a bit, albeit our research is a little bit dated, but we've been following this sort of tangentially since then. So I'd love to provide some thoughts on that and obviously solicit your feedback and your own observations on those developments. So this will be much more China-Latin America focused than it is Asia-Latin America focused, but bear with me as I offer these observations. So, I mean, I would agree entirely, certainly with the entire panel and specifically with Adrian and Vladimir who mentioned this, that we cannot really understand any of this, but the evolution of these fields, especially across these different industries, right, without understanding the geopolitical dynamics inherent in this moment and that dramatically impact everything that's happening at this juncture. I would say, and especially given the fact that so many of the section members here are from the United States, and 60%, I think, was the number, right? It will be, I think, critical to understand kind of what the dynamics are in the US in particular. So in the think tank community, some observations. There is considerable interest. For those who are familiar, right, with the think tank community, bear with me for a second, but I want to provide a little bit of background. I mean, there are those that describe themselves as nonpartisan, right? And some have effectively achieved that, although it's increasingly difficult to do. There are those that are more left-leaning and those that are more right-leaning. And there's some interesting trends underway in the type of analysis that each of these types of think tanks are exploring. The Inter-American Dialogue is a nonpartisan organization, and I was there for, I think, 16 years running what was called the Asia-Latin America program. And what we aimed to do was to fill what we found to be a real gap in the analysis, was to do a lot of research and investigation in Chinese to understand the wide-ranging policy and other developments in China that would be impacting the region. And then to communicate that to Latin American audiences, to US audiences, and others who would be interested, and Chinese audiences too, initially at least. And so we found this to be, a major contribution and have sought to, continue. I continue to work with the dialogue on some of this analysis, have sought to do this kind of work still. We see this as filling a critical gap. We see this as a non-political mechanism through which to communicate critical findings, right? And it's largely data driven, right? And so that is indeed still the approach. And yet, at this juncture, because of the politicization of the funding landscape, it's increasingly difficult to do this kind of work. So what do I mean by that? There has for many years been lots of US funding, right, in support of some of these initiatives, primarily coming from USAID, from the State Department and other institutions. Obviously, as we all know, USAID is no longer, and the State Department is taking a very different approach to a lot of the sort of outreach and funding that it's providing, whether in the United States or elsewhere. And so anything done on China-Latin America relations has to be done through a distinctly this moment lens. And therefore, studies that are largely based on data and which may or may not support a more hawkish view for China are not necessarily those that are going to receive funding. So accepting that funding necessitates, conclusions that will provide certain perspective. And so that has been an enormous challenge. The other is, funding from private foundations, which is still forthcoming, although some of those, Ford Foundation and others, right, are increasingly being reviewed based on their connections with China. So what they have done in recent years is to focus far more of their work, their attention on, and they remain very deeply committed to to analyses of the sort that we were promoting, and convenings and wide-ranging other work on this topic, that helps to understand how the field is to nurture the field, advance the field, and to understand developments in the relationship. One trend that we've seen there is a direction of funding away from US institutions and toward Latin American institutions, which is absolutely fundamental, is critical in order to nurture and build capacity in Latin America to do these studies. This is something that is quite critical. At the same time, it is very consistent with a message that I have received from China from day one, that nobody should be doing China-Latin America studies unless they're from China or Latin America. Which, you know, I mean, I've been told this 100 times, especially in my travels to China. And there, I mean, my response was always, there's a phrase in Chinese, which is, I mean, I always love using these sort of like poetic phrases in Chinese as justification for these things, but it's 眼睛看不见自己的目界, right? You can't, the eyes can't always see their own lashes, right? There's value in other perspectives, right? And bringing other perspectives to bear, as we all know, in area studies and in comparative studies. So I mean, it's been a tricky moment, right? For those who are trying to do this work, especially in the policy space in the United States. And that's part of the reason that I've transitioned from the think tank realm at this juncture to universities, where there is still that ability to, despite some pressure, right? There's still some ability to do more open-ended and apolitical, right, analysis on the developments and the relationship across domains, across disciplines, and even the ability still to travel to China, which is not something that I was able to do in think tank community, because China considers think tanks to be NGOs, and so you are subject to NGO law limitations. So especially as an American NGO, right? So, or US based. So just a little bit of perspective there. Within the academic communities, a couple of thoughts. For Latin American studies in general, enrollment, there's a lot of pressure on Latin American studies communities. Enrollment is down. Some area studies programs are under pressure to shut down. That has already happened in certain cases. There are still very robust Latin American studies programs at a number of universities that are doing very well, have high enrollment, are attracting investment, and have an administrative, large degree of administrative support. But this is a trend ongoing, and it has been underway for a number of years, that we're seeing less of a prioritization on area studies in general. This is compounded by the fact that international student enrollment has dropped by 17% in the United States as a result, obviously, of policy. Very intentional policy. And this is had a dramatic effect, especially on Latin American studies, because a lot of these students are coming from Latin America, also Asia. I feel this in my classes already, but we expect a much more dramatic effect next year. So to be determined how this all plays out, if this continues to be the case, but it's having a financial effect on universities, certainly on Asia studies, on area studies, and then a broader effect in general, including in the sciences and elsewhere. At the same time, there is it's not because of me at all, but classes on China and other regions are enormously popular. In part because I think those students that want to pursue Latin American studies or other studies, right, see the value, just as we've discussed, right, in understanding this intersection. Both because it is enormously impactful, right, for the region from a wide range of perspectives, but also because they need jobs, right? And they see this as maybe a link toward more in the way of job prospects, whether they are, especially for master's students, right, who may not be going into academic fields, may not be pursuing a PhD in the future. And one of the discussions that are I mean, certainly this is the case of Georgetown, this is the case cites among faculty, is we need at this juncture to help those who are doing Latin American studies to see the value, the classroom to job market value of what we are doing in the class on a daily basis. This is a necessity to keep all of this going, and thinking through that in a really critical, practical way is fundamental, especially given that a lot of those jobs that these students would have been pursuing in development, for instance, are not going to be available to them in the way that they would have been in the past. So how do we get them there? So Georgetown, for instance, just started a new program in data science, right, that within the Latin American studies. So it's the combining of the practical and so it's I mean, it's all a work in progress. Nobody has the answer at this juncture, and it's ever evolving. But I just wanted to share some of those thoughts. Let me say one more thing, and this is just about China's approach to Latin America. Latin American studies. What's been interesting is that, you know, as things dwindle down in the United States, they're picking up in China, and largely based on a study that the Chinese Ministry of Education did on the US effort to develop area studies during the Cold War, and the boom, right, that the US experienced at that point in time. Really understanding analyzing from scientific perspective how that was all done, how the financing happened, how different programs grew, and the effect of that on policymaking and other measures right over time. And so I had the fortune of seeing some of those studies. They're really quite interesting and extremely detailed. And so what China has done is to implement through the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Education a massive program to develop Latin American studies, right, and other area studies across the entirety of the country. There is a very clear and detailed program through which this happens. There are applications that different universities have to do. They receive the funding. Some of them are doing it very seriously, others are not, right? But there are certain criteria that each of these universities need to meet. And this has resulted there are language studies that are accompanying all of this as well, obviously. This has resulted in a boom, right, in Latin American studies majors, experts, right? What's interesting though is it has not contributed to a corresponding boom in academic analysis or, you know, later stage academic analysis on the region necessarily, at least not in the publications. You can't touch this from the non-publication. Instead, many of these students are being built into companies, right, that are based in Latin America. So it's as much a commercial venture as it is, you know, a venture in informing policy. It was a very big part of what the US was aiming to do. So it'll be worth kind of tracking how this all plays out. At the same time, you know, a lot of this has nurtured networks between China and Latin America that are educational networks. That can be leveraged to Latin American universities' benefit to develop more in the way of China expertise. They've done effectively. Some of these are very broad-based. Some of them are disciplinary in nature. Many of them are commercial in nature, right? So a lot of these linkages are based on specific interests in specific regions. So in Coquimbo, for instance, there's a university partnership that is based on the prospect of copper mining, right? In parts of Argentina, you have these university partnerships, especially in Jujuy province, and it's just on lithium studies. Right? Or Venezuela, it's on, you know, studies in petroleum engineering, and so bringing together those that can work in these fields to improve and enhance capacity. And so there are those. I mean, there are those like Tsinghua's, you know, abundant network in Latin America that can be enormously productive, I think, from a Latin American studies, Asia studies perspective. So thinking through strategically how to leverage those networks will be critical in the future. And I leave it there, but I just wanted to offer those observations, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have, and thank you so much to all our presenters, and we have 15 minutes for questions and answers, which means, which is not very little, but on the other hand, we've had a really rich set of presentations. So I think we're going to start by offering you the opportunity, of course, to ask questions, and to any of our presenters, or more generally, any question. And please keep your remarks brief so we can have their engagement as well. Gabriel.
More a comment.
Yes.
And it's very sad to hear that the inter-American dialogue is, you know, having all those problems. I have joined many of the seminars that you have organized, and it's not only about China. I know that is your area of that you focus, but you also organize about other Asian countries like Japan or Asian. And it's very sad because for researcher, it's a very important source of data that is very hard to get from China. I hope that there is a way that you can survive all these political problems in the US.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Any questions for our presenters online or in person? Any comments or questions from our own presenters with
I'd
respect to
just
the other?
like to address something that Ben said.
Yes, Fernando.
Un gusto conocerte, Ben.
Un gusto también.
I just want to make sure that, exactly what you said is what I always say. So don't think that academics think differently. And as you notice, I identify myself as a
You did.
migrant.
Yeah.
So I don't make distinctions, and I think that's one big problem in Australia. My students are absolutely shocked at the fact that, for example, there was the publication which I draw attention to them from the Policy Lab in Sydney, where it says you should care about the people you research on. Like, wow, where we getting there? So what you're describing is how most people who work social sciences, humanities, and are really knowledgeable of the methodologies and theories from the region work. So the problem I see here is that, the big pockets in higher education that are extremely conservative, and unfortunately, they are giving the back to communities. But now, because it's in fashion, they're all talking about lived experience, co-design, reinventing the wheel. And I'm thinking all the time, well, we have a new Columbus. A new Columbus arrived in higher education. So my invitation to you is get in touch with me, because we have done so many events at my expense many times of my career, because what I get all the time is, Fernanda, you have to be more individual focused. You are too community oriented. You are, reaching too much to the community. But now it seems like that's what we all have to do. So please do reach out, because we have a space for you, and we'll be very keen to put you into contact with our students and our communities, because that's the way I work, and I know many other colleagues do as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Fernanda. That's awesome to hear. Great to hear that it is happening. It has to be said, and I'm glad that it resonated with some of you. And I'm sure Raul will be able to connect us with. You mentioned New Colombo, and I'll probably continue to advocate New Colombo plan for Latin America. New Colombo plan for Latin America.
For those of you who are not from Australia, the New Colombo Plan is a special plan for funding international student mobility. And right now, it's very generous, it's well organized, it's run for many years, mainly to the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Asia more generally. But the Pacific, for some reason, kind of doesn't get all the way to Latin America. Should be.
Yeah.
This is interesting because many years ago, I was with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research based in Hiroshima, Japan, and the Pacific for them also excluded Latin America, even though at the one time the head of the office was actually a diplomat from Ecuador, but the Pacific is actually must include, right?
There is a network.
Pacific, yeah.
There is a network of universities that includes Ecuador, Chile, and Peru, and Mexico, the APRU. But you see, none of you know of it. Exactly. So this is the
question
problem.
of visibility.
Visibility, and they even have an indigenous knowledge network.
So may I just, if I'm allowed to say a few more words about our work with Margaret, and also within the section, because I joined the Asia and the Americas section, I think what it was still called Asia, the Pacific Rim, Latin America and the Pacific Rim, the section, and Adrian was co-chairing the section. It was my first experience, how many years ago, but well, long enough in the past. But then we started actually looking at the emergent area of studies back then. And I completely agree with Gabriel's comment about the importance of what some of the think tanks, serious think tanks are doing, like the dialogue. because it's not about maybe part of Asia, right? But the first ever event on Russia and Latin America was actually done by the Inter-American Dialogue, and Margaret was actually leading this efforts. So the invitation, if I may, Raul, propaganda política pagada, okay? If I may just invite you to follow the activity of the section. We just relaunched our bulletin where we actually provide information about the activities related to what we've been just discussing, call for papers, job openings, exchange new books published. We going once again to send it every month, and most likely next year, LASA in Paris. We are thinking about organizing a pre-LASA event, which is a tradition actually of the section that I learned from Adrian and some other people of the section. And we will be discussing the issues, continue discussing the issue that actually brought all of us here to Melbourne.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. Any questions, any comments? Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chikara. My name is Japanese, but I'm from Mexico.
That's right. Nice to meet you. Yeah.
I know. I'm going to speak in Spanish.
Please.
I don't want to spend so much time, but dos cosas. Una, yo pienso que siendo de Latinoamérica y tener un grado escolar o de college degree in Latin America is really hard. It's kind of a privilege, un privilegio en el buen sentido. Entonces, creo que eso simplemente justifica la existencia de muchos de los investigadores por sí mismos. Y lo otro es una pregunta para Fernanda y para Ben. No solo son personas de Latinoamérica fuera del país, sino también como mujer. Hay retos diferenciados, hablando de interseccionalidad, y Ben como joven también creo que enfrenta otros retos. No sé si nos quisieran platicar un poco más de ello.
Una excelente pregunta. Fernanda, primero, Ben, adelante.
Mira, sí. Te lo puedo resumir diciéndote lo siguiente. Yo estoy acá hace 17 años y he tenido invitaciones para hablar en universidades de Australia, 0. Hasta que el año pasado me invitaron en el Congreso de LASA Tomás, que está acá, y Fabricio, y lo leí varias veces porque pensé que me había confundido. Yo, por otra parte, organicé un foro con mi colega Beck Lewis en la Universidad de Sydney desde el 2009 y hemos invitado a un montón de gente, no solamente académicos, sino artistas, a lo latino, ¿no? De invitar a todo el mundo porque, como dice Ben, somos todos productores de conocimiento. Entonces sí, hay una desvalorización porque se asocia la enseñanza de la lengua y de las culturas como algo menor. Hay una desvalorización porque dentro de lo que es la institución hay discursos patriarcales y coloniales que hacen que mi identidad no esté dentro del patrón dominante y que obviamente mis valores como investigadora no son compatibles ni con el carrierismo ni con la corporatización de la educación. Yo me di cuenta que nunca me desprendí de mi noción de la educación pública y de mi responsabilidad como ciudadana de ampliar estos espacios de conocimiento debido a que tenemos fondos públicos. Pero cuando el rector de la Universidad de Sydney es un hombre que no tiene un doctorado, que nunca dio una clase en un contexto académico, que nunca publicó nada académico y sin embargo es professor, le ponen un título que es Professor of Practice y en algún momento de Off Practice gets crossed out, eso se va. Y entonces, whose lived experience counts? Whose lived experience counts? Porque yo, como mujer latinoamericana y otras mujeres académicas, no tenemos, bueno, ni que hablar aborígenes, No tenemos ninguna chance de construir una carrera académica exitosa sin eso mínimo, como mínimo. Ahora, ¿por qué un hombre blanco en Australia puede dirigir la universidad más antigua de Australia sin tener esas credenciales? Pregúntale cuánto le costó a Adrian ser profesor. No es algo simple, hay que hacer mucho. Es una disparidad y es una asimetría.
Muchas gracias, Fernanda. ¿Y Ben?
Raúl, me disculpas, pero no pude escuchar la pregunta muy bien desde acá. Pero qué buena contribución, Fernando.
¿Te gustaría comentar algo sobre lo que comentó Fernanda, Ben? Y tiene que ver, la pregunta tiene que ver más con lo
Con
que implica,
juventudes, escuché algo de juventudes, sí.
correcto, y lo que implica, pues,
Sí, me preguntó fue cómo se mueve como joven
exactamente,
este mundo académico.
exactamente, lo que es ser joven en el mundo académico y latinoamericanista en general. Y fue algo que tú comentaste también en tu presentación.
Mira, hay dos cosas. La primera, el elefante en el room, y es, no sé, tal vez me voy a arriesgar a decir que habrá alguna ignorancia en la sociedad en cuanto a Latinoamérica y lo que representa y las cosas que dicen y lo que vemos en Netflix y las redes sociales y lo que se habla y las bromas que para mucha gente son, sí, qué chévere hablar de esto, que ni siquiera lo voy a mencionar por respeto a todos acá. Eso es algo que lo tengo en mi mente desde el primer día que llegué a Australia hace 10 años, en cómo contrarrestar esa narrativa de que los latinoamericanos somos estos, hacemos esto y hacemos lo otro. Es cambiar la narrativa y mostrar lo positivo, que en momentos de crisis traemos a las comunidades juntas, que somos resilientes, que podemos crear impacto de diferentes formas, académicas, comunitarias, en políticas públicas y en gobierno. Así que hablar de eso es importante, pero mostrar, por ejemplo, como colombiano, en vez de que me hablen de esa figura de que hablan mucho, ¿por qué no hablamos de nuestra comida, de nuestra música, de nuestro deporte? ¿Quién no conoce a Shakira? ¿Quién no conoce a J Balvin, el café colombiano, nuestras flores? Eso es importante en el punto latinoamericano. Y en el último punto, porque sé que tenemos que terminar ya, Raúl, en el punto de juventudes, es intentar meternos. Sí, creo que tengo que terminar, ok.
No,
Tenemos una alarma.
es de una alarma,
Lo que causamos con esas discusiones. Está bien, lo dejo ahí, lo dejo ahí.
Lo viste todo.
Esta es la segunda
I repeat, this is a test only. Emergency. Evacuate now. Evacuate the building using the nearest fire exit.
Espero que no sea lo que preanuncia lo que no es.
Oh, because puede ser que nos estén perdiendo salir.
Evacuate now.
It's a test.
Evacuate the building.
He said it was a
Nearest
test.
fire exit.
He said it was a test.
Emergency.
Sí.
Para ustedes.
Okay.
Test is now complete.
Oh.
Qué buena finalización de evento.
Bueno, quería darles muchas gracias. I wanted to thank you all for coming to the first plenary, por haber venido a la primera plenaria. And by the way, this is the second event in a row where this happens. So I'm going to think that this is something to do with me here. But thank you so much again. And our second plenary is actually going to be about the growing links between Australia, New Zealand, and Latin America. And please continue the conversation throughout the event. Reach out to our panelists, of course, as well. And I'm really pleased that we're leaving, of course, with a very nice vibe, which is what, after all, characterizes, I feel, Latin Americans.
Invitamos para una foto, no sé.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raúl. Thank you, everyone. Good to see you, Vivi. Bye.